Hey everybody, welcome back to another edition of the Morgan Ortagus Show. Thank you for joining me on YouTube, on social media. We have an amazing interview for you today. I'm really excited. The former Prime Minister of Australia, Scott Morrison, he was in power from 2018 to 2022, oversaw a lot during that time, the rise of the Chinese Communist Party, COVID-19, AUKUS. You're going to learn all about this as someone that we had the privilege of working with in the Trump administration, and he has a new book out. So you're going to hear all about it right now on the Morgan Ortagus Show. It is a huge privilege and honor, Mr. Prime Minister, to have you on the show. Scott Morrison, welcome. Please tell my listeners who may not know about your tenure, and may not know about your background, tell them a little bit more about you.
Well, thanks, Morgan, and it's good to see you here in DC, and thanks also for the great relationship that we had when I was Prime Minister in Australia with the Trump administration. The US-Australia alliance, the friendship we've had between Aussies and Americans goes back over a century. We've fought in every single stoush there's been. We always turn up to each other's aid. So I love being here in the US, and we had a great relationship there with the Trump administration and got a lot done, particularly in the Indo-Pacific. But no, I became Prime Minister in 2018 and served in that role for almost 4 years. I'd had 5 years in the cabinet before that as the equivalent of Secretary of Treasury. I was the Treasurer and also had portfolios in the cabinet and border protection, which back when we were first elected, we had massive border problems. Back in 2013, we had boats streaming across from our north, and we made a promise when we came to government back then that we were going to stop the boats, and we did. And it was very successful, and that model has been picked up by many others now. But I just retired from Parliament a couple of months ago, and I'd been there for almost over 16 years, and so that was a long time in politics, but I enjoyed my time there, but now have moved on into the private sector and working here, amongst other things, with Ambassador Robert O'Brien in American Global Strategies. And we work closely with him and, of course, with Secretary Pompeo, doing a few things with Mike. And so it's good to come over here and catch up with some Yankee mates.
I like that. One of the things that I want our listeners to know, and I think this is incredibly important, is that you're a man of deep faith, of Christian faith. And that was so important, I can tell you. I went on every trip around the world with Mike Pompeo for 2 years until I was like well into my third trimester. Yeah. I was pregnant with my daughter and I got kicked off the plane. We went to Sudan, like to Khartoum, and everyone decided that they did not want me to have the baby on the Secretary of State's plane. But I went with him everywhere for 2 years, and I remember how excited he was whenever we were headed to Australia to meet you. And Mike Pompeo is a man of deep Christian faith as well, and that was he was so excited that you won. He was so excited to work with you, and I just think that's an important thing for our listeners to know is and I think it's rare in the world when leaders actually put their faith at the forefront of their politics.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, when Mike and I first met, we just sort of hit it off straight away. We knew about each other's faith, and that provided an obvious connection. And I remember when he and Susan came to Australia, and we hosted them for dinner at Kirribilli House, which is right on Sydney Harbour, the bridge there, the Opera House is there. It's a really nice place. And so we had a wonderful evening there. And the next morning, I often say, well, why don't you come to church with us? And he had to go and work the next day. He was meeting with my foreign minister the next morning. So Susan and Jenny, my wife, and I, we trooped down to our church in southern Sydney. We had a wonderful time, and so he felt a bit disappointed he couldn't join us. But you know, we'd message each other quite a bit and encourage each other in things of God. My faith, you know, I grew up in a Christian home. It has always been a big part of my life. And in the book I recently wrote, and we're just releasing now, it's really sharing more that story rather than a political story. Yeah, sure, I refer to a lot of the big things that happened, the pandemic, China, all of those sort of things, but through the prism, through the view of someone of faith, which sort of is the foundation for my life and so many.
That's fantastic. Well, you're here in the United States. You have a book called Plans for Your Good.
Yeah.
First of all, you have to tell us how our listeners can find your book, how they can purchase it, and why they should buy it. What's in it? What's the book about?
Well, plans for your good is drawn from a verse in Jeremiah chapter 29, verse 11. My plans are for your good, not your harm, to give you a future and a hope. And for me, you either believe that or you don't when you go through life circumstances. And it's not a book which, tries to share the idea that, God blesses you in all great achievements. I won elections, I lost elections, we had some great successes and we had some disappointments. But what I found through all of that, and particularly having to push through that pandemic period, which was just when everything turned on its head, and it was an incredibly challenging time that everyone was working through, faith just gave me a real grounding. So the book is more about how faith can help Christians live a life in what is an increasingly secular world, where our faith and our traditions and our Judeo-Christian values, our society is disconnecting from. And so how do you live as a Christian in that? And I try and share that story as someone who served in high political office, but it doesn't matter whether you're in high political office or you're teaching at a school or you're driving a bus or whatever you're doing. If you're a Christian living in today's Western society, it's not like it used to be. And so I hope it encourages people with my stories. It's not just about politics. It's my life with my family and other things, and people I met along the way who showed amazing faith in the challenges that they faced in life.
Well, I want to thank you as a Jewish American and a supporter of our ally, Israel. You have been so outspokenly supportive of the Jewish people worldwide, and certainly of the state of Israel. And that has been so important to us since October 7th, when we, of course, had a massacre of not only Israelis, but Americans as well. And we still have 5 Americans held hostage still to this day by a terrorist group. I saw recently, I think on X, you had called out the government of Australia for allowing and voting in favor of a so-called Palestinian state at the UN. Can you explain to our listeners why it was important for you to disagree with your government's vote?
Yeah, when I left politics, I want to avoid sort of being back in the domestic political debate. There's great people who now lead my party and they do those things, but the cause of Israel has always been very dear to my heart. One of the most special days I had was when I was awarded the Jerusalem Prize by the World Zionist Council. And I grew up with a lot of Jewish friends and kids where I lived in Sydney, and it's always been a big part of the community I've been part of. And after October, and as Prime Minister, recognised West Jerusalem, and it was probably the high point, I'd say it was the high point of Australia's support for Israel. And to see that completely turned on its head without any warning, and for what in the vote at the UN most recently, which was the pathway to recognition of a Palestinian state. Well, there's no government of the Palestinian state at the moment, which is, particularly in Gaza, which is nothing but a terrorist. And the idea that the UN would want to recognise a state that actually just is not functional and it doesn't exist, and worse still is run by terrorists, seems to me to go against every single principle that the UN's supposed to be about. And I've just found it very disappointing. We'd always had a very bipartisan position on Israel and Australia as well. And I was just disappointed that that nexus was broken over this. And you can present it any way you want, but at the end of the day, if there is ever to be a two-state solution, and I think there are major obstacles to that, you can have the ambition for it, and that's fine. But if that's ever to be achieved, it has to be achieved by Israel and Palestine agreeing. You can't preempt it. You can't gazump it. And to do this unilaterally, while Israel, one, is fighting for its absolute existence against terrorists, and B, when Australian Jewish citizens, American Jewish citizens, Jewish citizens around the world are facing this surge in anti-Semitism, just broke my heart.
Yeah, the question, everyone talks about, well, Israel needs a day after plan. Why is it their responsibility? Where are the Arab leaders, nations in the region? I mean, you have in Gaza, of course, you had a literal terrorist group, leading Gaza. And then in the West Bank, listen, the Palestinian people have not had good options. No. They either have a terrorist group leading in Gaza, or they have Mahmoud Abbas, who's a crook. Who's a thief? You know, I would love all of these, you know, the Hamas leaders that are in Qatar, or even Abbas and his sons, his children. They all end up billionaires. It makes me think maybe I've gone in the wrong line of business. But if you actually cared about the Palestinian people, you wouldn't have this awful choice of Hamas or Abbas. Neither choice is good for the Palestinian people.
I'd agree. If the administrations in Gaza or the West Bank had focused more on delivering health services and education services and housing services and sewage services, frankly, and their economic development opportunity for their people, rather than seeking the obliteration of the State of Israel, then I think their livelihoods would be very different today. And I think everybody agrees with that. And I'm disappointed for the Palestinian people that they've had terrible leaders and terrible governments that have rather to build tunnels than build hospitals.
That's right. They deserve better.
They deserve much better. And you're right that the region more broadly has a responsibility for that solution. And I thought the Abraham Accord was the biggest ray of light into that issue I had seen in my lifetime. Plenty of others had talked up that and what they could do in the Middle East, particularly here in DC. But there was one president who actually was able to move that agenda forward. And, you know, sadly, possibly what we saw on October 7th was the pushback against that progress. And, you know, they'd obviously been planning it for a long time. But the opportunistic way it was executed on the 7th of October, I think was no doubt influenced by the progress that was being made and seeking to thwart that progress.
So now we have to turn to something that is, I think, the existential threat for the United States and for Australia. That's, of course, the Chinese Communist Party. Now, you are a part of something that I think I'll be honest, I'm a critic somewhat of President Biden and his team. They haven't had many diplomatic wins, but a massive diplomatic win in my mind, and something I was very complimentary of, is something that you were a part of called AUKUS. Can you explain to our listeners and viewers what AUKUS is and what it's that agreement?
Yeah, AUKUS, it's a pretty funny name. There's no doubt about that. But what it is it's a deal between, I think, the three closest friends in the world, which is the United States, the United Kingdom, and Australia. We've always been there to back each other up. Australia's had a relationship with the US, a formal one called the ANZUS Alliance, which was formed after the Second World War, which is our alliance, which basically has connected Australia and the US together for all of that period. What this does is extend that with the United Kingdom and brings the three of us together. And it's about two big things. The first one is to make sure that all three of us have more nuclear-powered submarines. Not just moving them around from one to the other, but the three of us work together to ensure that we have more of what is the most powerful and most advanced form of defence technology anywhere in the world, to be a real presence, particularly in our part of the world, in the Indo-Pacific, and provide a real counterbalance to China. Now, the United States has only ever let that technology go to another partner once before in the late 50s to the United Kingdom. Plenty of other countries have asked since then, but we were successful in getting the nod. The work began under the Trump administration, I should stress. It went over 2 administrations. And so we worked all throughout 2020, working carefully with the Pentagon and others to work up the proposal. And then there was a change, and we had to start again a bit at a political level, but we were able to see that achieved. So there's the submarines, number one, because those nuclear-powered submarines, ours won't be nuclear-armed, but of course the UK and the US's are. But the other part of it is making sure we work together to have the most advanced defence technology in the world.
Right.
Everyone heard about AI and quantum and all of these things, hypersonic weapons, autonomous undersea, launch and recovery, all of these things. Because if these partners, if we can have the most advanced technology in defence, that enables us to keep and strike distance on what is our deterrent to what I call the arc of autocracy, which is led by China, which is asserting into the South China Sea, asserting into Japan and Korea's sort of domain. They've got their water cannons out on Filipino and Vietnamese fishing fleets almost on a daily basis. Yeah.
I think the point that you're making, I want you to describe it a little bit more for my viewers, because I think it's, and listeners, because I think this is so important. We talk a lot about the threat from the Chinese Communist Party and what they're doing here in America, physically here, the Confucius, I mean, you could go to the list, TikTok, others. But from a maritime perspective, and of course I'm in the Navy, you know, as a reservist here, so I very much care about the maritime space. But from a maritime perspective, China is incredibly aggressive on a daily basis, as you mentioned, to the Philippines, whether it's the Second Thomas Shoal, to the Taiwanese incursions into their airspace, all of you. So can you just break down a little bit more for everybody watching and listening to understand what exactly happens on a daily basis? How aggressive is the PLA Navy?
Oh, they're relentless. They are relentless. And the lesson we learned from the time during the Obama administration, when they kept pushing out and taking over what were atolls in the South China Sea, bits of coral and rock. And they turned them into installations, which they promised would
military installations,
they promised would not be military. And they break that promise, and now they're basically stationary aircraft carriers from which they can launch to attack Australia.
So they've basically, when you see that, they've taken these, it barely qualifies as an island, right? Like these little bits of earth, and they said, oh, no, we're not, we're just turning this into our little island. And then, of course, they've militarized it. They have the ability to launch from these.
So they are trying to push their sphere of influence, that they're trying to push where they can control things, right out from their coastline, what's called out to the second island chain, which if they get control of that, if they get control of Taiwan, the world will not look like it does now.
Yeah, I'm so glad you brought that up, because this is something that we talk about a lot on the Morgan Ortagus Show, and something that I'm hoping that you can help explain. You know, we are, as Australia is, I'm sure, in many ways, we're a bit of a war-weary nation. We were at war for 20 years in Iraq and Afghanistan, and things ended disastrously in August of 2021 and concluded with an ISIS attack that killed 13 Americans. And now we see ISIS Khorasan has a foothold in every province in Afghanistan. And so the thought of, God forbid, a U.S. military incursion with China over Taiwan is something that scares and alarms people, especially with the Chinese Navy being bigger than our Navy.
Not as capable.
No, definitely.
Nowhere near as capable.
Amen to that. But still, you know, you certainly are concerned by a near peer competitor that we haven't had. And you know, a lot of people say to me, you know, Mr. Morrison, former Prime Minister, of course, they will say to me, oh, well, the Chinese haven't fought in a long time. Well, neither has our Navy, right? I mean, it's been quite a long time since we've had to fight a near peer competitor from a Navy perspective. However, you know, obviously deterrence is what we all hope for. Nobody wants to go to war with China. That would be disastrous for both countries, for yours as well. And we need to deter them. But explain to me and explain to our audience why Taiwan is so crucial. Why must we be willing to fight to keep Taiwan independent?
Well, and I want to stress two things. One is, and it's not just in the US's interests. It's in Australia's interests, it's in Japan's interests, it's in Korea's interests, it's in Singapore's interests, it's in the interests of the entire Indo-Pacific, the Philippines and so many others. If China were able to claim Taiwan, then that would put them in command of all the biggest trade routes in the world. They would have captured the biggest producer of semiconductors anywhere in the world. And they would be able to project their power and influence right across the Indo-Pacific, the most dynamic, fast-growing region of the world. And, you know, the Indo-Pacific today is what Europe was, you know, back at the time of the First and Second World War and before. And so it's the center of the world. It's where everything is happening and will happen. And so if they're able to gain that foothold in Taiwan, it puts everything at risk. Our economy, it puts things such as, you know, what we define as human rights. I mean, one of the things China wants to do is change that rules-based order based on universal human rights that was established under American leadership after the Second World War. What China wants is the same thing Russia wants and Iran wants and North Korea wants. They want to be able to run their part of the world, no questions asked, do whatever they want, and do to you whatever they want, and do to their own citizens whatever they want.
That's right.
And that's what's at stake. And so if China's able to claim Taiwan, then that gives them the strongest possible platform to exert their their way of living, their way of thinking about the world on the rest of the world. And that only encourages Russia and Iran. And what we've seen, particularly in the Ukraine, is how they've, all those countries aren't necessarily the best of friends, but they've got similar interests in undermining the US-based world order. And so it's so important. If we care about freedom, Ronald Reagan, peace through strength, was a great ambassador of freedom. If we care about that, well, that's what Taiwan's about at the end of the day.
They're a democracy.
Yeah, and a great democracy, too.
I was just there a few weeks ago, well, maybe it's been a month ago now, and I haven't, I was not there for 6 years. So it was definitely incredibly interesting. I met again with President Tsai and incoming President Lai. And so, but I think, one thing that when you talk about the rules-based order, everything that the world has enjoyed since World War II, since, the United States and our allies and friends won that war, I think that it's really important for people to understand what the Chinese Communist Party does to people of faith and to religion in their own country.
Yeah.
And because sometimes I think we say this phrase, the rules-based order, and I say, like, what does that mean? No one knows what that means. It's important to remember that in China, they replace a picture of Jesus on the churches with a picture of Xi Jinping.
Yeah.
In China, they've edited the Bible.
Yeah.
You don't get the word that you read, the Torah that I read. You certainly wouldn't get that in China because they've edited anything that they think of the Word of God that is runs counter to
Hitler
the philosophy
did that
of Hitler did that too to the Chinese Communist Party. And of course, we know there's an ongoing genocide against Muslims in Xinjiang in China as well. So I think it's, I think it's incredibly important when we say things like defending the rules-based order, that means defending freedom of religion.
It doesn't mean freedom of religion. It means the human rights and values that we can too often take for granted in Western society.
Yeah.
The things that we just assume to be there every day, that you can go peacefully about your business, that you can have a market-based economy where you've got great opportunities to make something of your life and the community that you can enjoy. All of this, the communist parties, states, tell you what your human rights are, and you don't get to argue about it. Russia wants to do the same. Iran wants to do the same. They have a very different view about how the world should work, and they are not holding back in trying to enlist support for that. They're very active in developing countries around the world. They're investing a lot of money there. It's very important that countries like Australia, the United States, and Europe and others are also reaching out to those countries. So they've got a choice. I know in our part of the world, whether it's in Indonesia or Malaysia or wherever you are in the Indo-Pacific, they just don't want the choice of China. They would like to be talking to us US pension funds and things like that, and having private capital from the West actually investing in their industries and things like that. Japan has been doing that for many years, and that's a good thing. So what's at risk is our way of life at the end of the day, and we can take that for granted sometimes where we are, but if you're living in China and you're a Christian, the things that we take for granted are a daily struggle and threat for them.
Well, I know you're no longer Prime Minister, but I'm going to ask you a pointed question because I agree with everything you just said. So if it comes down to it, will Australia fight with us?
Look, I have to be careful how I answer that, given the role I used to have. And the way I've always answered it is, sure, the ANZUS Treaty, which is the treaty I mentioned from 7 years ago, where Australia automatically comes to the aid of the United States if there is an attack on home territory. It was invoked during September 11, for example. That wouldn't occur in this. But I've always argued that our own interests would be so impacted and compromised by Taiwan being under attack from the PRC that there is a very clear argument why we would be doing whatever we could to prevent that.
And it was obvious too when you were Prime Minister, whenever COVID happened, and when you were standing up to the Chinese, and they started the economic coercion against you guys, which totally backfired. Tell that story.
Well,
really quick.
I mean, to be honest, my view was quite practical. We live in a part of the world where we're surrounded by developing countries, where there are wildlife wet markets everywhere. Now, I think there's been some great journalism which has sort of uncovered potentially what the ultimate source of this was. To be honest, I'd prefer it to have been out of a lab environment rather than the absolute, chaos of whether it could just occur in any old wildlife wet market, which there are thousands, hundreds of thousands of them throughout Southeast Asia. And I was just appalled that the PRC was so lacking in transparency. I mean, it's called COVID-19 for a reason. It didn't happen in 2020, but that's when we all found out about it. And they withheld that. And they have resisted every action of any government, particularly ours, but also the United States and others, on coming clean with what happened, so you can prevent it from happening again.
Exactly.
I mean, millions of people were killed. Economies destroyed, livelihoods destroyed, people's mental health. It was just such a devastating period in which to be trying to lead a country. Now, Australia, we came out of it pretty well. Our economy, the strongest of any of the advanced economies. Our death rate was, we saved 30,000 lives. So we're pleased. It wasn't perfect, but it was pretty good in comparison. But, there has to be some accountability for this. And I think what happened with COVID-19 is a really good example of why, China's threat is so real. They probably can't say, well, why wouldn't we tell people? Well, why should we be open to this? What right does anyone else tell us about how we're managing our labs and whether dangerous viruses are escaping? Or why wouldn't we stop our researchers and doctors and others from telling people about what was happening? Well, that's not a world that I want my kids to live in.
Well, it has been a fascinating conversation. We've gone all around the world. The book is called Plans for Your Good. Former Prime Minister of Australia, Scott Morrison. Tell us again, where do we find the book? You
can find it on Amazon and all online sellers, Barnes & Noble, all the rest of them, they're all there. But if you go to plansforyourgood.com, you got a link to all of those. And it's out now, so I hope you enjoy it. I hope it's encouragement. I'll sign your copy now, Morgan. And I hope you enjoy it, and you and Jonathan. And it's really great to be here in DC with you again. And I'm looking forward to catching up with Mike and everyone else. And it was good to see the former president last night as well. And it's terrific to see him looking so resilient and leaning forward.
Your lips to God's ears. So, of course, this is the former Prime Minister of Australia, Scott Morrison. This is what we do on the Morgan Ortagus Show. We bring you presidents, prime ministers, senators, all the newsmakers from around America and, as always, around the world.